It feels a little different, doesn't it? Not having some of these people that we're used to around us. I know I feel a little funny here, just me and Paul in the sanctuary with no Stuart. And I know people feel the absence of our magnificent spirits this Sunday. It feels a little different. And friends, that's not an accident. Our church in March jumped into Zoom services without missing much of a beat. For those who perhaps don't remember, because it was a while ago, one of the first images we saw was a performance by Diana Ross and the Supremes of Someday We'll Be Together. I don't know if any of us really thought that in July we would still be talking about that possibility as something in the future. I think some of us thought that, but none of us was sure. There was no sign telling us how it was we were to go. Many in worship weekly will tell you that things are going fine. We have, pretty much the same service. Much of it is live and in person. We have an amazing video editor and an incredible amount of work being done by the spirits to bring these live film performances to you. There hasn't not only been an interruption, in some ways, worship has taken a step forward. But if I tell this to many, many other people, other faith communities going through these times, other faith communities maybe even just down the street, if you say this to them, they might think you are bragging. Because just in Hawaii alone, there are churches that just aren't meeting anymore. Some are recording all of the elements of service into one video throughout the week and then just playing that service, that manicured video on Facebook or YouTube at the appointed normal worship time. And I know this is not a holy thing to say, perhaps, but as your minister, you should know. And I should confess that a little part of me, when I hear that, thinks, quitters. No. See, all joking aside, there was a lot about church that was disrupted. No doubt. But in some ways, we have not experienced the level of disruption so many of our sibling faith communities are experiencing. So today, we want to feel that a little bit. Because some of us could use a little disruption, I think. So many of us are experiencing the constant streaming of newsfeed after newsfeed. But an altogether unholy feeling descended on me recently, when I noticed that traditionally conservative news outlets even are starting to look at the world and actually starting to make sense and see what's clearly in front of them. Friends, in seminary we learned about apocalyptic events in all faiths, in all history, but none is more profound than this one important prediction I remember from an apocalyptic literature class. It went like this. And in the 5th month of the plague, the great sign of the coming of a new age shall be made known, when MSNBC and Fox News agree with one another and do share like criticisms of the current abomination. So, some would translate that as administration, but my Akkadian isn't what it used to be. So, however you see it, however we translate it, we are in a new era, my friends. So pardon the disruption today, please, but it is good to remember what we have here. Religious communities, they have been dealing with disruption, well, forever. In fact, religious communities or faith communities of all kinds only exist because of disruptions to the usual order of things. Just one example, Buddhism only came about when someone steeped in the traditions of the Hindu faith took what they had learned of that faith and began a new tradition. A practitioner of Hindu once explained to me gently that Buddhism is to the Hindu faith what Protestantism is to the Catholic faith. But these are only discussions about what I might call brands of believing. But even before religions had these brands, local traditions, customs, beliefs, and practices came to be part of life for many developing human societies to help explain so much of what was happening around our ancestors. Maybe crops were especially good one year and then they were particularly bad the next. It's only natural that someone might wonder whether what they had done that first year was better than the next. It might go like this. I planted the seeds when the weather was warming up in both years. I remember that. I also watered the areas where the seeds were planted. Yep. I remember that as well. Then in the first year, I remember I would take my shoes off outside because I hadn't built the mudroom yet. But then this year, I built that cursed mudroom and my crops were ruined. Clearly, I have angered a deity by bringing my muddy shoes into the house, and from this day forward, all shoes will remain out of the house, and I will worship the god of the outside shoes henceforth. Now, I'm aware I'm making a point rather broadly here, but religious scholars believe much of the very first roots of religious feelings in the world grew up in this way. Again, very broadly, with nature happening, disrupting what many hoped would be continued prosperity for the families and towns, and then ascribing a meaning or a cause to the disruption or alteration. So pardon the disruption, but there is more going on here than we can control ourselves. And it's not only the world's first faiths. These kinds of traditions are alive in many younger traditions as well. There's the story of the church that has this very special part of their processional. Now, a processional isn't something we do here. It's when the clergy or others who will be presiding over the service enter the space and come down what is usually the center aisle. In this one church, there were 3 very distinct moments in the processional when all those in the processional would stop, they'd bend their heads slightly, and then walk forward in that posture, then right their heads again. They would do this 3 times before getting to the front of the congregation, and many in attendance noted the reverence of the group in bowing and walking this way. They wondered about the meaning of these 3 pauses, this bending. Was it to do with the way that the church thinks of its divine source in 3s? Was it simply a deep expression of humility? Whatever it was, people loved it. So one day, a child was in attendance and watched this procession. And after the service, the child went up to one of the celebrants of the worship and asked about the bowing of the heads. And the celebrant actually explained, so he said, this is not the first sanctuary we've known. In fact, it's the 6th sanctuary we've used. But many centuries ago, when our order was just starting out in the Dark Ages, we met in a basement. And across the ceiling were enormous beams holding up the floor above the foundation of the building. The beams disrupted the walk from the back of the sanctuary to the front because they were low enough not to let the celebrants at that time pass without stooping. So our first founders would bow their heads slightly, then walk under the 3 enormous beams before getting to the front of the congregation. And when we moved to another sanctuary, even though the beams were no longer there, what we'd done for so long just became part of what we continued to do. There was no need to disrupt what we were doing, plus, people seemed to like it. See, church, or really any life of faith, is always a balance between dealing with disruptions from the outside world and seeking sense or comfort from those disruptions in our faith, in one sense, and then wondering whether our faith needs a disruption of some kind to deal with the world we are all inhabiting together in another sense, outside in or inside out. So pardon the disruption, but are we letting our habits pass under the beams of history, unquestioned, unchallenged, unperturbed? The tradition of our own faith, of Unitarian Universalism, is one of pretty much disruption, traditionally. Many of the historical events that shaped our history were highly disruptive. When Miguel Servetus challenged the doctrine of the Trinity in Geneva and proclaimed a unified Unitarian idea of the divine, he was burned alive for this belief, and disrupted forever the life of John Calvin, not to mention his legacy, who demanded that he be executed in the town square there in Geneva. When Ralph Waldo Emerson gave a sermon to the Divinity College at Harvard in 1838, he proclaimed a sense of the divine that had little or nothing to do with creedal or dogmatic faith. He planted a flag in the ground for a way of thinking and believing that is accessible to all and unified across many traditions that share a single teacher, is the word he used, or spirit. Ordaining women when no one else would, performing weddings for same-sex couples when it was illegal, and talking about white supremacy culture in teach-ins on white supremacy long before any other church, and more explicitly than many other churches. And the list goes on, but our faith likes to disrupt the status quo whenever it is called to do so, and I know a lot of us are here because that is the tradition we hold to. That is the tradition that feeds our souls. That is the tradition we love. So pardon the disruption, but why on earth are we compelled to do this? Are we dyed-in-the-wool contrarians? Or is there something more to the disruptive nature of what we do with our faith? I saw a shirt recently that only had 3 words on it. It said, disrupt, dismantle, decolonize. That's a good shirt. In the 8th principle that this church has adopted, we strive to dismantle the white supremacy culture and other forms of oppression that founded so many of the traditions of the world we inhabit. But that shirt made me wonder, have I skipped a step? What about disruption? Many of us recently spent a week or so at the Unitarian Universalist General Assembly, where all who want to can gather to do the business of the UUA. And throughout the week, the focus there was very much on the legacy of colonization and all that it has wrought in the souls of persons and the nations it ravaged. And the week also brought to mind many ways that dismantling the house built by the tools of the oppressor might come to pass, but I fear there was still something missing from this discussion. Something that is as plain as a t-shirt to some, disruption. And I dare say that it is not news to this group. I dare say that many of us have been in situations where we see colonial attitudes or white supremacy culture right before our eyes, and what happens sometimes when it does? I freeze, or I'm not sure what I'm supposed to do or say. Even after taking 2 weekends of Jubilee anti-racism training or more, I freeze, and I want to stop this. I want to stop this now. A great step forward has been made by the regular teaching of the interrupting racial microaggressions by our 8th Principle Task Force. This kind of work, getting on its feet, disrupting this kind of work, and I bet many, many people here in this call, in this worship service, feel more comfortable taking on this task after taking that time. And that's wonderful, because a person cannot really take a look at how true dismantling works, how meaningful decolonizing works, until that person can learn to disrupt what we see happening right before us, at the dinner table, at the conference table, at the convention hall. Pardon the interruption, but there is still a lot of work to do before we can dismantle or decolonize. So today, we mourn the loss of a legend, first of the civil rights movement of the 50s and the 60s, and then through the halls of Congress. John Lewis, friend and colleague of Dr. King, advisor to presidential elections, recipient of pervasive state-sanctioned violence, and statesman of decades, a very conscience of the House of Representatives, as persons on both sides of the aisle were apt to call him, has died. I've shared some of the messages of this extraordinary person's life with you before. One of my favorite pieces of advice from John Lewis gives is this: you must be bold, brave, and courageous, and find a way to get in the way. This is a loud call to disruption from John Lewis. But we must also remember his sharing this, that many of us shed blood to participate in the democratic process. And an account this week of his life on CNN News quoted him as saying that as the more peaceful protests he led gathered numbers and notoriety, the more peace he sought in his disruptions, the more violent the response was from the state. For I say to you, nothing so frustrates violence as throwing peace in its face. Disruption has its costs, still today. But John Lewis was also trained as a minister. It was actually his life's ambition from his early childhood. Growing up, he would preach a sermon every night to the chickens he'd help his mother with tending. And he thought that his call was to be in the chancel, like this. But it was in seminary. The people he met, the texts he was reading, when he learned about something many sadly failed to see in the very lines of the text he was studying. That the universe, that the divine, that justice of a community must seek, must be measured not by the ruling power's prosperity, but by the suffering of those who are ruled. And that when injustice, when manifest harm and wrong is wielded by a state against a people, that is not God's will. At least that's how John Lewis saw it in his faith tradition, and that's how Dr. King saw it too. And one of the most powerful moments of faith that came from this belief is the movement today known as liberation theology. Now, liberation theology is the theology that comes directly from the Christian tradition. I mention this because there was a lot of discussion of liberation theology at General Assembly. I've even heard a few people say that they're interested in learning more about what this branch of theology really is and what it's really saying. But one thing I can tell you, one thing liberation theology is not, is liberal. One must never think that liberal theology, which is much of what we talk about here, and liberation theology are interchangeable. They are very distinct. Liberation theology describes a very specific branch of faith founded by a Catholic priest named Gustavo Gutierrez in the poorest part of Peru in the 1960s. And central to his beliefs is what is called a preferential option for the poor. This is the theory that God has a special place in God's heart for the poor of a society, as Jesus proclaimed in many different ways, and that a society will only be saved, or God's kingdom will only come to be true, when the poor in the world suffer no longer. I give you this clear enunciation, and I know that some of you listening to this language are a little uncomfortable from it coming from a pulpit here at a Unitarian Universalist church, but this branch of theology simply cannot and should not be separated from its original context. One of the sharpest Unitarian Universalist minds teaching and writing today in theology is Paul Razor. And Professor Razor, in his book, Faith Without Certainty, which is a must-read, again, the name is Faith Without Certainty. It's a must-read if you're interested in learning more about theology, what it is, what liberalism is, versus a lot of other theologies, and the way a liberal faith like ours can approach different theologies with care and with truth and with certainty. He says this about liberation theology. Liberation theologians rarely worry about whether their conception of God and other theological categories conform to contemporary philosophical or scientific thought. They do not share the liberal preoccupation with making the Christian message credible for educated modern skeptics. Instead, their focus is on how that message is liberating for those on the underside. As a result, liberation theology's criteria are explicitly pragmatic. Theology is true if it is liberating, if it leads to liberating action in the world. They do not trouble themselves with the questions. There is a certainty there. What they look for are the results. Liberation theology is deeply disruptive. It takes the idea of a poor underclass and points to it not as a critique of civil society, not as an aspect of life to be analyzed or talked about in philosophical discourse, but as something that is happening against the very will of God and must be stamped out. From the earliest ways our world was troubled and our crops failed, not to mention our cops failing, to the ways our ancestors bowed their heads whether they needed to or not, disruption becomes part of the order of the day. But when the lives of good persons, rooted in faith that sees justice as an affront to all that is holy, growing in a faith that calls for peaceful, impactful disruption of the status quo, and maturing into a life inclined to nothing short of revolution, when lives of good persons like these come to an end, when they are disrupted, there is really only one thing we can do. Pardon the disruption, but the world is aching now with an illness that is disclosing the deepest divisions among those with access to health care and those without, those with one kind of skin color and those without. Pardon the disruption, but a faith we hold to, that we hold out to the world, must be a faith that impedes injustice, implodes inequity, and implores mercy for those who suffer. Pardon the disruption, but until our faith grows in each one of us, until justice flows down like waters, until change springs up from the very earth, until equity reaches a loving hand across oceans, across continents, we must disrupt, and know that the work of the very power of nature that scared our ancestors, the work of habit that bore the groove of discipline for other ancestors, the work of theology that says poverty is an affront to all that is holy, the work of the very divine in us, around us, holding us close, the only work we must do before dismantling and decolonizing is the work you know we really want to do. So pardon the disruption, but it is time to get to work. May it ever be so. Blessed be, and amen.